The sun was blinding over the Philippine POW compound that August morning of 1945. Dust shimmered in the air as a group of captured Japanese nurses barefoot, hollow-eyed stood by a mess tent waiting for rations. An American cook dropped a tray of bread, slathered with something white and glistening. One of the nurses whispered, "Shio, salt." Hunger pushed curiosity past fear. She broke off a piece and touched it to her tongue. Her eyes widened. It wasn't salt, it was sugar. The moment hung in the heat. The other women froze, then swarmed closer, whispering disbelief. For years they'd eaten bitter barley cakes, rice husks, and the memory of better food. Now sweetness. It was like tasting sunlight after living underground. One of them began to laugh, then choke, then laugh again, clutching her chest. Reports estimate over 300,000 Japanese soldiers were captured by Allied forces by war's end, but less than 1% were women, mostly nurses and clerks. These women were supposed to die before surrender. Instead, they stood here, sugar melting on their tongues, feeling something close to home. An American sergeant nearby frowned, confused. To him, it was just sugar, barely worth noticing. But to them, it was freedom condensed into a crystal. A few of the women wept quietly, the kind of tears that come from remembering a world you thought was gone. One nurse, Lieutenant Fumiko Takahashi, later recalled in her diary, "We were prepared for death, not sweetness." The entry stopped there, as if words failed her after that taste. The laughter faded into silence. A breeze lifted the smell of diesel and canvas. Flies returned. The world was still war, stained and cruel. But for a few seconds, sweetness existed again. That single taste triggered something deeper. An ache that reached back to a time before surrender, before hunger, before everything turned grey. A memory of home kitchens and ration cards, of children chasing candy that no longer existed. Her mind drifted backward, carried by the ghost of that flavor. To Tokyo before it all fell apart. Before the camps, before defeat, there was the empire disciplined, proud and starving. Tokyo 1942. The lights dimmed earlier each night, and the scent of sweet things vanished from every market. The war had cut Japan off from its colonial lifelines, no more sugar from Formosa or the Philippines. Housewives stirred tea with barley syrup. Mothers pressed sweet potatoes into children's hands and whispered, "Pretend it's candy." Inside military hospitals, nurses rationed glucose like gold dust. By 1944, even that was gone. The Imperial Ministry of Agriculture reported that Japan's sugar imports dropped from nearly 1 million tons in 1937 to less than 20,000 by 1944. The sweetness of life had been erased, replaced with slogans and silence. Fumiko remembered the kitchen of her childhood home, the clink of ceramic bowls, her mother's gentle scolding not to waste sugar on rice porridge. That tiny luxury had become unthinkable. Wartime posters warned, luxury is the enemy. So people learned to stop wanting. But want never truly dies, it hides. Soldiers at the front dreamt of candy more than medals. Nurses traded soap for syrup, smuggled drops of honey from field hospitals. Hunger stripped dignity, but it couldn't erase memory. Fumiko once caught a soldier trying to lick the crystallized sugar from a medicine jar. She hadn't scolded him, she'd understood. Sweetness, he muttered, is for peace. It was the last thing he said before dying of infection the next morning. By 1945, Japan was a machine running on fumes. The war offices kept issuing ration tickets for goods that didn't exist. Housewives lined up for hours for half a cup of rice mixed with weeds. Children grew thin, soldiers thinner. Sweetness became mythical, a rumor from the old world. When Allied bombers finally roared overhead, flattening cities into cinders, no one thought about sugar. But deep inside, a collective craving lingered, wordless and stubborn. The war had taken metal, land, pride, but it had also taken taste. Now, in that POW camp thousands of miles away, the flavor of one stolen crystal reopened everything buried by discipline and loss. The sweetness pulled her backward, then hurled her forward back into the unbearable present. The sound of an engine, low and rhythmic, snapped her from memory. The rumble of Allied trucks approaching the camp gates. The trucks rumbled through the compound gates, raising clouds of ochre dust. The Japanese nurses stiffened instinctively. Boots meant orders, and orders usually meant pain. But this time the men climbing down wore clean khaki, not tattered uniforms. An Allied guard motioned toward a line of newly built huts. No shouting, no striking, just quiet efficiency. The women exchanged wary glances. For years they had been told that capture meant torture. Better to die than surrender, their officers drilled. Yet the camp smelled of boiled vegetables and soap, not rot and fear. One by one, they were led through a delousing tent, then toward the showers. The first touch of warm water drew gasps. Steam curled upward, blurring faces hardened by jungle sun. Some of them hadn't bathed in months. Fumiko rubbed her arms, watching layers of grime slide away. The dirt wasn't just physical. It felt like the war itself washing off. Clean clothes followed ill-fitting Allied uniforms that hung loosely on shoulders sharp from hunger. Then came bunks with real mattresses, blankets, and metal trays of food. A guard handed each woman a spoon and nodded toward a long table. The rice was overcooked, the bread foreign, but the smell was overwhelming. According to Red Cross records, U.S. POW camps provided an average of 300 calories per day, even for prisoners. In contrast, Japanese soldiers in the field survived on barely 200. The difference tasted like shock. The nurses hesitated, uncertain whether to eat or bow first. One whispered, "Is this a trick?" Another replied, "If it is, I will still eat." From the far end of the mess tent, an American sergeant observed their every move, trying to decode the sudden tears that came with the first bites. To him, this was protocol. To them, it was impossible mercy. Fumiko felt both gratitude and shame. The bread filled her stomach, but the kindness unsettled her more than hunger ever had. For years, the word enemy had been absolute. Now it blurred like steam on tin plates. Then from the kitchen tent came another smell, sweet, faint, almost familiar. She froze. Sugar. Steam drifted across the compound as if carrying a promise from another world. The women looked up, breathless. Something extraordinary was about to happen. The mess tent buzzed with metal clatter and murmured English the women barely understood. Then came the moment that would stay carved in their minds forever. An Allied cook carrying a battered kettle of tea. Behind him, a corporal placed a tin canister on the counter. Its contents shimmered pale white under the canvas light. Sugar. No one moved. Fumiko's hands trembled around her cup. The cook, unaware of the quiet awe he'd caused, spooned a heaping measure into the tea and stirred lazily. "2 lumps, if you like," he said with a grin, sliding the kettle toward her. She hesitated. Sweetness had become a myth, something whispered about in hospital wards before the front collapsed. With deliberate slowness she stirred her cup, the spoon ringing faintly against the metal. The first sip was cautious, then stunned. Heat and sweetness flooded her mouth. Her eyes filled instantly. Around her, the other nurses mirrored the reaction. A low chorus of gasps, muffled laughter, disbelief. One woman clasped her hands together, as if in prayer. Reports note that a teaspoon of sugar carries barely 16 calories, but to these prisoners, it was more nourishment than a full ration. It wasn't about hunger. It was about memory, about life before war. An Allied corporal leaned to another guard. "You'd think we gave them gold," he muttered. Fumiko caught her reflection in the dark tea, cheeks sunken, lips trembling, eyes no longer dead. The sweetness revived something primitive and human. For years, sweetness had meant weakness. Soldiers were taught that comfort softened the will. Yet in that moment it meant survival. "Sweetness means life," she whispered, surprising herself. The cook smiled, unaware she'd spoken Japanese. "What's that, miss?" She shook her head. "Nothing." she murmured, still tasting warmth. For the first time in years, laughter drifted across the tent. It startled a nearby guard who nearly dropped his tray. The sound wasn't mocking. It was alive. Outside, the evening sun burned orange over the camp. Sugar cubes clinked in metal mugs. The war had shrunk their world to pain and orders, but now something vast opened inside them. And from his post the American guard watched, puzzled. Why did sugar make them cry? Sergeant William Haynes didn't understand what he was witnessing. He had seen battlefields turned into mud and bone, but never a room full of women crying over tea. From the corner of the mess tent, he watched the Japanese nurses cradle their cups as though holding fragile treasures. No one argued, no one begged, they just felt. He scribbled a quick note in his pocket logbook. Female POW reacted unusually to rations. Appeared euphoric. He underlined euphoric twice. To him it was strange but harmless, to them it was sacred. Afterward he approached one of the nurses, Fumiko, though he didn't know her name yet, and offered her a refill. She looked up, startled, as if caught stealing joy. "Thank you," she whispered in halting English. Her voice trembled like the porcelain cups they used to dream of. Back home, Haynes had a wife who baked pies every Sunday. Sugar was nothing to him. But here, it became a measure of what the war had taken from others. The humanity it had buried. Later that night, he wrote again, they reacted as if reunited with family. He paused, staring at that line, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, guilt. In the camp's daily reports, morale incidents among POW had dropped nearly 40% once nutrition improved. The officers called it stabilization. Haynes thought it looked more like healing. Across the barracks, Fumiko whispered to another nurse, "They think we are fragile. They don't know hunger." The words carried no bitterness, just quiet truth. As the camp settled into its nightly hum, Haynes walked past the women's quarters. Through the cracks in the wall, he saw faint candlelight and heard laughter. Soft, unsure, but real. The war had turned everyone mechanical, but here were humans rediscovering wonder through a spoonful of sugar. He leaned on the fence, exhaling into the humid air. How strange, he thought, that something so small could change the temperature of a soul. Behind him, the generator sputtered out. Darkness swallowed the camp, but inside the women's hut the glow remained. Sugar still lingered on their tongues, dissolving slowly like the idea of an enemy. And in that darkness, memories began to stir, old stories waiting to be spoken before morning came. Night fell thick and slow over the camp, the jungle humming like a giant clock that refused to stop ticking. Inside the women's hut, the lantern hissed softly, its glow catching dust and faces that had forgotten how to relax. The laughter from dinner had faded into something quieter, something closer to confession. Fumiko sat cross-legged on her bunk, her tin cup beside her, the last trace of sugar still at the bottom. Around her, voices rose in whispers. One nurse spoke of stealing molasses from a field hospital in Manchuria, how she dipped her finger in and cried because it tasted like home. Another remembered baking red bean cakes with her sister before the air raids. Each story ended in silence, like a prayer cut short. Beyond the canvas walls, a faint radio crackled from the guard post. Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade floated through the night, foreign and fragile. The women listened, mesmerized by a melody from the side of the war that fed them now. By 1945, according to Allied nutrition reports, nearly 60% of Japanese troops were undernourished. Starvation was not a punishment, it was the system. Nurses had watched entire battalions wither, powerless to help. "We were healers," Fumiko whispered, "but we could not stop them from dying." One of the younger nurses asked, "Do you think our families know we live?" Fumiko didn't answer. No letters had arrived, no word from Japan. In their minds they were already ghosts. A mosquito buzzed near her ear. The air smelled faintly of soap and oil. For the first time in years they were clean, fed, and unafraid of the next hour. It felt wrong, like stealing comfort from fate. Outside, Haynes passed by again, flashlight beam brushing against the hut's canvas. He heard them speaking softly, almost chanting, words he couldn't translate but felt in his chest. Amma, Amma, Ait, a sweet, sweet. The music faded into static. Someone blew out the lantern. Darkness swallowed the room, but a small warmth lingered, the taste of sugar, the echo of laughter, and the first fragile hope that life could still surprise them. Then, as the cricket's song swelled, a sharp bugle call split the night. The camp's signal for dawn inspection already beginning to sound. The bugle's metallic cry sliced through the humid dawn, pulling every prisoner from the thin comfort of sleep. Boots scraped on wooden floors, tin cups clanged, and the familiar rhythm of discipline reasserted itself. Despite captivity, order still ruled their bodies. The Japanese nurses rose in near silence, folding their blankets into perfect rectangles as if back in a military ward. Outside, the sky was pale silver, and the camp smelled of wet earth and kerosene. American guards barked instructions, but without menace. The women lined up automatically, uniforms wrinkled yet spotless, hair tied back with makeshift ribbons cut from old bandages. Dignity was the last possession they refused to lose. Fumiko glanced at the guard tower. A man waved, cigarette dangling from his lips, and nodded slightly, a gesture neither friendly nor hostile. Just human, she nodded back before catching herself. Old instincts warned against acknowledging the enemy. But the line between enemy and savior blurred more each day. At roll call, an officer read names slowly, mispronouncing most. The nurses bowed in unison, disciplined even in defeat. The sight made the American clerk pause mid-sentence. He'd expected hostility, not ritual. A Red Cross report later noted that 92% of Japanese POW in Allied camps survived, a survival rate shockingly higher than the roughly 40% for Axis POW in Japanese custody. Numbers that told a quiet truth. Captivity under the enemy could mean life instead of death. Breakfast followed oatmeal thick with sugar. The smell drew everyone to attention before the whistle even blew. The women accepted their trays with quiet reverence, each spoonful both strange and familiar. Fumiko ate slowly, letting the sweetness spread. It wasn't indulgence, it was remembrance. Around her, the other nurses chatted softly, voices no longer brittle. Even laughter returned, small, cautious, but real. Haynes watched from the doorway, arms crossed. They still bowed before meals, still whispered thanks to unseen ancestors. "They make war look like a ceremony," he muttered half in awe. When the meal ended, the women stacked trays neatly, wiping each clean before return. Routine had survived the Empire's collapse. Then, from the kitchen tent, a new scent rolled through the air, stronger, richer. Sugar again, but mixed with something deeper, something symbolic. The women turned, alert. A new ritual was forming. By the third week in camp, sugar had become more than food. It was currency, comfort, and confession. What began as a spoonful in tea turned into a quiet ritual that only the women understood. Every morning, when rations were served, they would each save a pinch from their cups, wrapping it carefully in scraps of paper or cloth. Some tucked it into pockets, others hid it in their sewing kits. To lose it felt like losing a piece of themselves. The Allied cooks thought it amusing. They act like we're giving diamonds. One joked, but to the prisoners, each grain carried meaning. It was proof that gentleness still existed somewhere in the world. When one of the nurses fell ill with fever, too weak to eat, Fumiko sat by her bunk and unwrapped her ration. She poured her tiny stash of sugar into a cup of hot water and pressed it to the woman's lips. The others watched in silence. "Medicine," Fumiko whispered, "for the heart." According to camp supply records, each Allied kitchen was allotted roughly 6 pounds of sugar per 100 prisoners per week. It wasn't much, but within that scarcity, generosity bloomed. They began trading sugar not for advantage, but for hope. A cube for a favor, a spoonful for a story, a taste for a memory shared. At night, before lights out, the nurses would sometimes dissolve their saved sugar together in one pot, stirring slowly while recounting fragments of home. Families lost, cities burned, friends gone. Silent, the sweetness gave them courage to speak of things they couldn't say otherwise. Fumiko started to notice how her pulse steadied with each ritual, how the bitterness of surrender softened. The sugar wasn't just sweetness, it was survival disguised as ceremony. One evening, an American nurse passing through the camp stopped by, curious about the gathering. She lingered by the tent flap, watching these women share their secret communion. Their laughter sounded almost childlike, unburdened for once. When she caught Fumiko's gaze, she smiled, a small, hesitant bridge across the chasm of war. The next morning, that same American nurse returned with something hidden under a folded cloth. Her steps were quick, nervous. The women fell silent as she approached. Wrapped inside was another cube of sugar. The American nurse's name was Margaret Hayes, though to the Japanese women she became simply Megusan. She was young 20, 4 freckles beneath her fatigues, and carried herself with that casual confidence Allied women seemed to have. The Japanese nurses watched her with quiet fascination as she stepped into their tent, holding a small paper-wrapped cube like a peace offering. "She set it down on the table for you," she said softly. No translation needed. The sugar glinted in the dim light like a sacred relic. The women bowed deeply. Margaret blushed, unsure how to respond, then awkwardly mirrored the gesture. Laughter broke out, gentle, genuine, a rare sound in a place built for control. That moment wasn't just polite exchange. It was the collision of two worlds that had been trained to despise each other. The Japanese nurses had grown up on slogans that called Westerners devils. Margaret had read pamphlets painting Japanese soldiers as fanatics. Yet here they were sharing tea and silence, both too tired to believe the lies anymore. One of the older nurses poured water into a cup, stirring the cube Margaret had brought. She offered it back to her, bowing, "Please, together," she said in halting English. Margaret hesitated, then sipped. The sweetness hit, and her eyes widened. They laughed again. Camp records show that around 20% of Allied POW medical staff were female, many volunteers who rotated through Asian camps after 1945. Some wrote that they were startled by how the Japanese women carried themselves with precision, modesty, and unexpected grace. Margaret began visiting daily, teaching them bits of English in exchange for origami lessons. One morning, Fumiko carefully folded a sugar wrapper into a paper crane and handed it to her. Margaret smiled. "We'd be friends in another life," she whispered. Fumiko didn't understand the words, but she caught the tone, and nodded. For a few minutes each day, the war felt paused. No propaganda, no orders, just women sharing something simple and human. That evening, as Margaret left, she slipped something into Fumiko's hand, a small cloth bundle. Fumiko waited until the nurse disappeared into the dusk before opening it. Inside were 2 sugar cubes, perfect, untouched, white as snow. The camp fell quiet after lights out, except for the scratching of pencils. The Japanese nurses huddled near the lantern, writing letters that might never be delivered. Paper was precious, borrowed from Allied clerks, each sheet thin as breath. Every stroke had to count. "Dear Mother," Fumiko began, her hand shaking. "I am alive." She paused. How could she explain captivity? How to describe the enemy's kindness without betraying everything she was taught to believe? She tried again. "We are safe. The food is sweet." Then she stopped, staring at that last word until the ink bled. Across the barracks, others were writing too. Some wrote to children they hadn't seen in years, some to brothers who were likely dead. One nurse simply drew pictures, mountains, waves, cherry blossoms. None dared mention sugar, though it had become their daily miracle. By Allied regulation, every letter would be screened, translated, and censored. According to records, only about 1 in 5 Japanese POW letters ever made it home. Many were returned unread, addressee deceased. Still, they wrote because silence was worse. Margaret passed through, collecting the envelopes into a tin box. She hesitated at Fumiko's note, catching the faint smile drawn beside her name. A small sun doodled in the corner. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Fumiko only bowed, unsure if beauty was still allowed in war. That night, the women placed their letters in a row on the table, as if sending prayers across the sea. The lantern's flame flickered, making the ink shimmer like tears. "If they knew," one nurse whispered, "if our people knew we were treated kindly." She didn't finish. The others nodded. In Japan, capture was shame. To admit comfort in captivity would mean disgrace. They'd call us traitors, another said. Outside, Haynes stood beside Margaret, watching through the tent flap. "They're writing ghosts." He muttered. "Letters to a country that's already gone." Margaret said nothing. She just held the tin box a little tighter. When dawn came, the interpreter gathered the letters and carried them to headquarters. His steps were slow, deliberate, guilt-heavy in each one. He knew most of those letters would never see home. Behind him, the women watched in silence as their words and their hope walked away. By late September, the camp had settled into a rhythm inspection, rations, roll call, rest. But behind the routine, quiet debates simmered among the Allied officers. Why, some asked, were they feeding their former enemies so well? Weren't these the same people who had marched Americans through Baton? Others argued back. Morale prevented chaos, order demanded dignity. The argument wasn't moral, it was logistical. Food was control. Sergeant Haynes overheard it all from outside the mess tent. "You starve them, they revolt." One lieutenant snapped. "You feed them, they obey." Another replied flatly, "You feed them, they remember you're human." The words stuck with him. In war, supplies meant survival and superiority. The United States military could move food like it moved bullets. Records show that the U.S. spent nearly $1.80 per POW per day, double what Japan spent on its own soldiers. Sugar, bread, even coffee arrived in crates stamped Philippines. To Haynes, it was paperwork. To the women, it was a miracle. From her barracks window, Fumiko watched Allied trucks unload sacks of flour and tins of condensed milk. She remembered back home how her hospital staff had boiled rice water for the wounded because real sugar no longer existed. Now the enemy's abundance fed her. It was a humiliation wrapped in mercy. "They conquered us with kindness," she murmured, unsure whether it was admiration or grief. At dinner that night, Margaret joined them again. She told stories about ration lines in America, how even civilians had gone without during the war. "But not like this," she admitted, glancing at their thin wrists. She tried to make them laugh, sprinkling a spoonful of sugar over oatmeal like confetti. "See, celebration breakfast." The women laughed politely, but none reached for extra. They'd learned restraint too well. Later, Haynes wrote in his journal, "Strange to see victory measured in spoons. We feed them, they stop fearing us. Maybe that's the real weapon." Outside, the evening cargo truck groaned under new shipments, crates marked in stenciled black letters. "Sugar Manila Depot." Fumiko stared at one as it passed, the word almost glowing in the dusk. Somewhere deep inside her, a thought formed uninvited. What happens when mercy becomes temptation? The next morning, temptation would test them. Temptation started small. A nurse pocketed a sugar cube for later. Another tucked a spoonful into her handkerchief. Nobody spoke of it at first. Hunger had taught them secrecy. But by the end of the week, every woman had a hiding place, inside boots, beneath mattresses, sewn into the linings of sleeves. Sugar had become contraband, not out of greed but preservation. Sweetness was safety, something to save for the next unknown darkness. In the Allied kitchen, rations were carefully tallied. When the head cook noticed the shortage, he shrugged. "Mice," he said, but Sergeant Haynes wasn't convinced. He'd seen the nurses' careful manners, the way they lingered over tea, the faint bulge in one woman's pocket when she walked away from the mess line. He didn't report it, not yet. Fumiko knew the risks, but she couldn't stop herself. Every cube she saved felt like reclaiming power, the power to choose when to feel alive. She hid them under the floorboard near her bunk, wrapped in wax paper. At night, she'd take one out, hold it against her lips, and let it dissolve slowly without biting. It wasn't rebellion, it was memory therapy. By then, camp logs were noting increased missing sugar incidents. Records indicate that about 40% of reported POW thefts involved sugar or chocolate, more coveted than cigarettes or soap. Commanders dismissed it as harmless, but the women treated it like an underground movement. They called it Am I No Cage, the shadow of sweetness. Margaret eventually discovered their secret stash while changing linens. Instead of reporting it, she whispered, "Hide it better." The women froze, unsure whether she was joking. Then she winked. In that brief rebellion, friendship deepened into complicity. For weeks, the small thefts continued, unspoken yet understood. Sugar was no longer ration. It was symbol, salvation, and defiance rolled into one. But war has a way of turning kindness into suspicion. One morning, an officer stormed through the kitchen shouting about missing inventory. The guards were ordered to inspect every barracks. When the women heard the word inspection, hearts stopped. Fumiko's hand went instinctively to the floorboard where her secret cache lay hidden. Outside, Boots approached. Shadows moved across the window slats. The inspection had begun. The air inside the barracks turned thick and heavy, as if even the dust knew to stay still. Boots thudded outside, measured, deliberate, a shout in English, then the door creaked open. 2 Allied officers stepped in, followed by a Japanese interpreter holding a clipboard. Routine inspection, the interpreter announced. The nurses stiffened instinctively, hands folded at their sides. The officers began searching bunks, lockers, corners methodical, precise. The women's eyes followed every motion, trying not to breathe too loudly. Fumiko's heart pounded like artillery fire. Under her bunk, beneath a loose plank, lay her secret, 6 sugar cubes wrapped in wax paper. She could almost hear them rattling. The officer's boots stopped inches away. He bent down, her throat tightened. He lifted the plank. Silence. The paper glinted faintly in the light. The interpreter frowned. What is this? No one moved. Then, slowly, Fumiko stepped forward. Her voice was steady but soft. It is mine, the interpreter translated. The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly unsure how to handle contraband so innocent. He unwrapped the packet, revealing the sugar inside. The women collectively held their breath. Camp protocol demanded discipline, but there was no rule for stolen sweetness. The officer looked at the cubes, then at the women's hollow faces. He sighed, put it back. He said quietly, then turned to leave. No punishment, no lecture, just an unspoken mercy. Later, in the camp log, the incident was recorded as a minor infraction. No further action. According to Allied manuals, food theft under £1 was considered negligible, but to the women the decision felt monumental. A glimpse of compassion inside a machine built for order. When the door closed, the nurses exhaled in unison. One of them began to cry silently, shoulders shaking. Fumiko replaced the sugar beneath the plank, this time with a prayer instead of fear. That night, the barracks was quieter than usual. Even the guards outside seemed subdued. The rain began softly, first a patter, then a steady rhythm that drowned the memory of boots and shouts. Fumiko stepped outside, lifting her face toward the sky. The drops hit her skin cool and clean. For the first time, she didn't flinch. Behind her, the others followed, bare feet splashing in puddles, laughter rising against the thunder. The storm came suddenly, thick sheets of tropical rain hammering the tin roofs, turning the dusty camp into a river of mud. Guards shouted for order, but no one listened. The Japanese nurses had already stepped outside, faces lifted, laughing like schoolgirls let out of class. For once, they didn't care about discipline or dignity. The sky itself had broken open, and the world felt clean again. Fumiko's hair clung to her face as she twirled barefoot in the puddles. The sugar she'd once hidden now melted in her palm, dissolving into rainwater. Around her, the women began to hum a low, wordless melody that rose and fell with the thunder. The guards hesitated. Sergeant Haynes stepped out under the awning, cigarette forgotten in his hand. "Let 'em," he said quietly. "They've earned 5 minutes of being human." In the chaos of war, small mercies rarely lasted long. But this one did. For nearly half an hour the women danced in the storm. Their laughter cut through the static air like bells. Some scooped rainwater into cups, others spun until they fell, the mud streaking their uniforms. According to meteorological logs from that season, Allied camps in Southeast Asia averaged nearly 30 inches of rain each month. For the prisoners, it was both torment and blessing, flooding their tents one day, washing away despair the next. As the downpour softened, Fumiko knelt and cupped a handful of muddy water to her lips. "It tastes sweet," she said, surprised. Maybe it was her imagination, maybe a trick of memory, but it reminded her of that first sugar cube. Nearby, Margaret watched, shoes soaked, smiling faintly. It tasted of rain, earth, and forgiveness. She would later write in her diary. That line would survive the war, scribbled in fading ink across pages yellowed by time. When the storm finally eased, the women stood silently, breathing in the clean air. The rain had erased everything, the fear, the shame, even the invisible lines between guard and captive. Then came the rumble of an approaching engine. A jeep rolled through the puddles, carrying a mail sack stamped in bold letters, Headquarters Postal Service. Haynes frowned. Mail deliveries weren't scheduled for another week. He called out, "What's this?" The driver shouted back, orders and letters. The rain stopped. Every heart in the camp held its breath. The jeep splashed to a stop in front of the command tent, tires hissing on wet gravel. An officer jumped out, clutching a sealed folder stamped TOP priority. The air shifted, conversations froze mid-sentence. Even the jungle seemed to quiet. Fumiko and the others watched from behind the fence, raindrops sliding down their faces as if the sky itself were holding its breath. Moments later, the camp loudspeaker crackled to life static, then a strained American voice. "Attention all personnel," it said. "Tokyo has accepted Allied terms. The war is over." No one spoke. The words hung there unreal. Some guards cheered weakly. Others simply stared at the ground, as though victory were too heavy to feel. But inside the barracks, the women didn't move at all. Their world, built on obedience and sacrifice, had just evaporated. Fumiko felt her knees weaken. Surrender was unthinkable. They had been told the Emperor would never yield. Yet here it was final, undeniable. The Empire was gone. Reports from that day describe similar scenes across hundreds of POW camps. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast reached an estimated 100 million Japanese citizens and soldiers overseas. For many, it was the first time they had ever heard his voice. For the captured nurses, it was the moment their purpose dissolved. One woman began to sob quietly. Another whispered, "If the war is over, what are we now?" No one answered. Margaret found Fumiko sitting outside, staring at her reflection in a puddle. "It's finished," she said softly. Fumiko looked up, eyes red. "Finished," she repeated as if testing the sound. Haynes walked by with a cigarette, exhaling hard. "War's done," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "Now comes the waiting." As night fell, the camp's floodlights flickered on. Guards loosened their belts, prisoners loosened their fear. For the first time, no one was watching anyone else. The silence was enormous. The next morning, trucks rolled in with crates of food marked Victory Supply. Among them, extra sacks of sugar. The cooks began boiling kettles before dawn, the scent of sweetness spilling into the air like a promise of peace. The morning sun rose calm and gold, turning puddles into mirrors across the campyard. For the first time, no roll call echoed. No orders, no shouted commands. The war was over. And so was captivity. Word spread quietly. Repatriation would begin within days. Ships were coming. Home, whatever was left of it, was waiting. The women stood in a loose circle outside the barracks, each holding a small ration tin. Inside every tin one sugar cube. The cooks had handed them out with breakfast, calling it victory ration. For the nurses, it felt like a farewell gift from the world that had held them gently instead of crushing them. Fumiko turned the cube in her palm, its edges catching the light. It was perfect, crystalline, too beautiful to eat. Around her, others wept silently, some whispered names of family they might never see again. Margaret approached, sleeves rolled up, hair frizzed from humidity. "The transport trucks leave tomorrow," she said softly. "You'll be taken to Manila, then by ship to Japan." Her smile wavered. "You'll be free?" Fumiko bowed low. "Thank you," she said in halting English. Margaret hesitated, then leaned forward and hugged her. It was brief, awkward, and absolutely human. Reports from Allied Command confirmed that repatriation operations for Japanese POW lasted over 18 months, involving millions of displaced personnel across Asia and the Pacific. But no report captured what it felt like to stand at the edge of war and feel the weight of peace pressing in. Before boarding, the women gathered one last time inside their hut. Fumiko placed a sugar cube on the center table. "Keep it," she told the others, "for the next who comes hungry." One by one, they added their cubes until a small pile gleamed in the lantern light. Sweetness reborn as a symbol of survival. Haynes watched from the gate as the women loaded onto the trucks. They didn't look back. He reached into his pocket and found one forgotten sugar cube Margaret had slipped there. For a long moment, he just held it, unable to throw it away. The engines growled to life, exhaust curling upward like incense. As the trucks pulled out, Fumiko glanced toward the horizon, toward a home she no longer recognized. The ocean waited beyond the road, and her satchel clinked faintly. Inside it, one small tin, still half full of sugar. The ship docked in Yokohama under a sky the color of ash. The nurses stood at the rail, clutching their satchels, silent as the coastline emerged, familiar yet unrecognizable. Smoke still rose from the ruins where cities had once stood proud, where houses collapsed like broken teeth. The empire they'd served with blind devotion was gone, replaced by a wasteland of hunger and surrender. When they stepped onto the pier, no one was waiting. No families waving flags, no welcome banners, just wind and rubble. A Japanese officer in a tattered uniform took their names, stamped their papers, and waved them through without meeting their eyes. They were not heroes, they were survivors, and survivors made people uncomfortable. Fumiko walked through the shattered streets of Tokyo 3 days later. The smell of charred wood and sewage clung to everything. Children scavenged through debris for metal and rice husks. Women in rags sold wilted vegetables by candlelight. The sound of Allied jeeps echoed off the empty buildings. She ducked into a tea stall, a roof patched with tin, walls papered with ration slips. The old woman behind the counter poured her a cup of thin, bitter brew. No sugar, no milk, just survival. According to post-war Ministry of Health data, daily rations in Japan had dropped to as low as 900 calories per person. 80% of Tokyo lay in ruins. Even rice, once sacred, was scarce. Fumiko sipped slowly, the bitterness scraping her throat. Across the table, a man muttered, "They fed our enemies better than us." His voice wasn't cruel, just hollow. Fumiko stared at the liquid in her cup, unable to reply. He didn't know that she had tasted mercy in captivity, that the enemy's sugar had once made her cry. Later, alone in her rebuilt room, a small corner of a bombed-out house, she unpacked her satchel. The sugar tin was still there, dented but intact. She opened it. The cubes had fused slightly from humidity, but their whiteness remained. She touched one gently, the crystal cool against her fingertips. The sweetness belonged to another world, but it was the only proof she had that kindness could survive even in war. She closed the tin carefully, as if sealing a heartbeat inside. Outside, the wind rattled through the ruins, carrying faint echoes of laughter from a time when sugar had meant salvation. Tomorrow she would open it. Morning light filtered through the shoji paper, soft, unforgiving. The war had been over for years, yet its echoes still clung to everything. The hum of air raids that no longer came, the ration lines that still snaked through alleys. Fumiko sat by the window of her rebuilt home, her hands thin but steady, the sugar tin open before her. The cubes had aged into imperfect shapes, edges dulled, scent faintly earthy. Still, they sparkled in the light like memory refusing to die. She picked one up, holding it between her fingers as if it might vanish. She boiled water over a small coal stove and poured it into her chipped porcelain cup. The sound was gentle like rain on the old barracks roof. With a quiet breath, she dropped the cube in. It hissed once, then dissolved slowly, turning the water golden. She watched it melt, the last remnant of her captivity, her salvation, her shame. Then she lifted the cup and drank. The sweetness was delicate, almost shy, yet it filled the entire room. For a moment, she was back in that Allied camp. The steam, the laughter, the strange kindness of enemies who had become her witnesses. According to trade records, by 1952, Japan's sugar imports had recovered to pre-war levels. Stores once again displayed candies, pastries, and jars of syrup. Children who had never known war ran through streets clutching sweets their parents could finally afford. But for Fumiko, sugar would never again be just sugar. It was proof that gentleness could survive even in the ruins of hate. On her wall hung a faded photograph, her and Margaret, smiling outside the camp mess tent, uniforms wrinkled, hands clasped. Two women from opposite sides of a broken world, caught in a brief ceasefire of compassion. Fumiko set the empty cup down and closed her eyes. The sweetness lingered at the back of her tongue, as quiet as forgiveness. War took everything. She whispered, voice barely audible, but not this taste. Outside, the city buzzed, vendors shouting, trams clattering, children laughing. Life had returned, louder than memory. But in that small room, the air still carried the scent of boiled water and sugar, the smell of peace rediscovered. And as the sun climbed higher, the light caught her empty cup and made it shine.